People with ADHD are hypercritical. It's that sense of, if I'm feeling this anxious, it must be because I'm not very good at it. And that needs to be challenged as a thought.
And we've got Dr. Joe Perkins.
I'm a chartered psychologist
who specializes in psychological optimization
and has worked with some of the biggest companies in the world.
ADHD and sleep, any tips?
Because if we're not getting enough sleep, everything's compromised. And that doesn't just mean, I will go to bed at a certain time. We have to work out.
Do you think there's a correlation between neurodivergence and high-performing and highly successful people?
No matter how senior, professional, successful, slick, will undoubtedly have struggled in their earlier life around this, where only you tried harder, you've got great potential, but you go through this process of being delivered negative labels. You internalise that. How can that not affect your self-esteem?
Why do people with ADHD mask?
I think...
Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Alex. Really appreciate it.
If I were a new client in your practice and I were to sit in front of you, confused and undiagnosed with any neurodivergence, but you had an inkling that I might have ADHD or autism, where might you steer the conversation to find out more?
Typically, if I'm seeing a client that's coming to me and they're talking about some of the challenges they're experiencing, and they mention that they're thinking they may have some symptoms and signs of neurodivergence, whether that's ADHD or concerns that they may be autistic, I'd really be keen to understand what kind of challenges they were experiencing, what gave rise to them thinking that. Or if I'm noticing that they're doing certain things in the conversation. A lot of times clients might talk to me about having repeated attempts at being maybe more organised, repeated attempts at doing something and, in their words, failing, and causing them huge distress, and they may have certain kind of narrative around that as to their incompetence, their inability to do something. And if I was seeing a sort of trend there in terms of how they have maybe approached things and consistently had a pattern of not successfully sort of quote unquote getting through and making progress, I might start to explore what was going on there. And that might reveal that they're actually having some challenges with their executive functioning, their prioritization, organizational skills, that they might lead on to me helping them to identify some strategies that they could use, but also as the conversation develops over a series of a session or two, maybe point them in the right direction and start exploring with them what other challenges they might have. Do they have any anxiety? Do they have any other neurodivergent kind of traits and manifestations? And if so, what are they and where they might go? And just see, through that conversation, some people will immediately respond to that with their concerns and their sort of insights already. Some people may be very resistant to that, so I would never want to steer someone down that road. It's only if it would be helpful to them. But it would be very important for me to understand, because the way I might work with someone who is trying to be more organised and stick to a routine and stick to a habit and is really struggling to do that, I would work with them differently to someone neurotypical. Because if someone's tried something and they're struggling to do it, there's very good reason for that. They may be telling themselves they're stupid, they're lazy, they may have had that messaging for all of their lives. So they're trying to push through. That isn't going to change anytime soon, but a different approach is much more likely to yield some progress and some success. So it's helpful for me to know, even if the person I'm working with may not want or appear to be ready to hear some of the sort of neurodivergent aspects.
It makes so much sense. I mean, listening to you say that reminded me of my own story a lot, and that sort of unknowingly going through that process, that cycle of overworking, burnout, exhaustion. And when you don't have that awareness of that burnout, you just work through it, and the results can be really catastrophic.
Yeah.
When you signpost someone, they go off, say they get an ADHD diagnosis, what positives, what negatives do you see in them when they come back after a diagnosis?
Well, as you'll know, Alex, probably from your own experience, but also many of the guests that you've spoken to, the diagnostic process is very challenging in itself, whether you're going the private route or the NHS route. So there are challenges. So let's have that in mind, to know that process in itself can be very grueling, disheartening, and what it does is that can be the very key focus for a long time. So what will often happen if I'm speaking to someone who has shown up and they've either been recently diagnosed or are in the process, they may be experiencing some of the positives when they've got that diagnosis will be, well, there's no big surprise because actually to commit to something like that, you're probably pretty convinced there's something there, if not necessarily what that might be. So if you get it, it's like, okay, there can be a huge relief, as we all know, that's often expressed out there publicly, but actually it can be also really complex. A lot of the time behind closed doors, when I'm talking to my clients, people will often express a sense of bewilderment. So now what? I've got the diagnosis. I thought that might be the thing, because a lot of people will talk about how life-changing it can be, and it can be, but it's not necessarily the diagnosis in and of itself. It's how you process it, how you make sense of things. I think a lot of people as well, it's quite complex. It's a dynamic and changing process. It takes a lot of time for some people to get to the point where they're comfortable. And comfortable might not even be the right word for people in many instances to talk about the diagnosis, if at all. A lot of the time it will be, what do I do with this now? What does that mean to me? Does that change everything that I've known to be true? How do I recalibrate and incorporate this diagnosis? What does it mean? Do I feel uncomfortable with it? We internalize a lot of negative biases. So even though it may be really positive on the one hand, we can then be confronted very quickly, especially with the busy sort of ADHD brain of, but what will people think of me? Will people believe me? Will that mean that people think there's something wrong with me? Will that mean that I am going to have more problems? Do I have to have medications? There are so many questions and emotional responses. And again, depending on the path that someone's been through, some of the negative things can be, well, I wish I'd known this sooner. If I'd known that sooner, I would have been able to do something about it. Then I wouldn't have gone down that path. Other people, and you can have both of these experiences in your own way, will go, well, thank goodness I know that now, because now I can manage it differently. There may be, treatment available that might involve medication, but it might be that you can manage yourself differently, a combination of those. But as well, you are still you. So some of it is just, again, that recalibration. So there are, in my experience of working with people, it's never fully positive, it's never fully negative. It's like many experiences in life psychologically. There's lots of coexisting emotions and it changes. And also what I think is really important, and I don't know if it's always discussed openly, a lot of this the sort of challenging elements around the diagnosis process and then on diagnosis are experienced behind closed doors. Often when people share their story, they've done the processing, maybe in a safe way or with people that they've trusted, and they're then comfortable to share. But a lot of people, bear in mind, aren't sharing when they're not in that place. So you often only hear the good stories. So it's quite an interesting experience that people will be struggling before they get to that point with navigating those different, how should I feel? Because I don't feel like that. It hasn't quite transformed me in the way that I hoped. And I also speak to some people that have huge elation and relief at first, and they go, this all makes sense, now I know what to do. But the reality is they're still them, which is the beauty of it. But also for them, it's like, oh, I thought that might now mean things will be different. And of course, everything's different, but nothing's different. So you're still having the same challenges until you learn the strategies and understand. A lot of people will talk to me, it's like, well, I've got the diagnosis, but I still don't really know what that means for me, because I'm still trying to make sense and understand how that, what's me, what's ADHD, what is the bit that I need to respond to and manage. And that can take time. And it's kind of an ongoing process, I think. I don't think we get to a point where you go, oh, it's all nice and neat and done.
I always described when I got my diagnosis as I got an explanation, but I didn't get the answers. And what I meant by that is it gives you a huge amount of clarity and understanding why certain things happened in the past. But for me, behind the scenes, and leaning into your point just there, it really made me hyper-focus on the negatives. And when the negatives did happen, it almost put me into a bit of a shame spiral, because now, yes, I had an explanation for it, but also knowing what it is doesn't always make it better. And I was very hesitant to post about it on social media at first. On LinkedIn, I had a professional reputation. I didn't necessarily know if it was the right thing to do. I did, and it got an overwhelmingly positive response, and now I obviously do it full time. But huge stigma stopped me originally. Is that something you think people contend with?
In huge amounts, Alex. But you've articulated it really, beautifully, because I think that is definitely something that I'm seeing a lot of. And I think as well, what it's interesting is people get diagnoses maybe because someone has suggested to them that they might want to get, late diagnosis this is, or one of their children or multiple children may have had a diagnosis, and it's kind of come that route, which is a very common kind of late diagnosis pathway. And not only are you kind of perhaps as a parent navigating what does this mean for my child to have this sort of label, which can be really helpful and beneficial, but equally does have that stigma. And there's still a lot of ignorance, misunderstanding, miscommunication out there in the world that really fuels that. So I think there's that stigma isn't imagined. And thankfully, things are changing. People like you and anyone else out there with that voice and sharing their experiences is beginning to break those barriers down, and more importantly, give examples of high-functioning, healthy, manageable ADHD, if you like, even though we know that it can be challenging in very real ways. I think that it's not this kind of caricature of the little boy that's causing chaos, because as we know, or at least if you know, that is very small as a kind of characteristic. It's most people, it's certainly in my experience, and definitely in females, but I see it in males, haven't got that hyperactivity in the physical, obvious sense. So it's often misunderstood and not seen in the world. I mean, what does it look like? So I think there is, until that's more understood, that stigma will perhaps remain a bit.
What do you think it is that makes people later on in life come forward for an assessment? I think for me, it was like this cycle of overwhelm and doing interesting things in very narrow areas of my life, but 90% of my life behind the scenes was a car crash, and it was chaotic. And eventually that led me to think something might be going on. What do you think are the main things that cause adults to seek assessment for ADHD?
Well, what I would see in practice would be either, again, something that really lockdown, as we know, did. People lost the structure from school, universities and workplaces overnight. And that, not only did you have this kind of perfect storm, if you like, of people watching more social media, people having more time to post on social media. So again, a lot of really brilliant information being out there that was being shared and people were able to watch it. But actually watching it whilst having lost the structure that would perhaps have hidden it, made us not aware about it. And that awareness and education is meaning that people go, hang on, I recognize that. So that's a very common feature that I will see people saying, well, that made me realize there was something I could really recognize, or someone may, with the increased diagnosis that people are seeking, people will now talk about it in a way that just wasn't being talked about a few years ago. The other things that will happen will be, again, that some people will have got their diagnosis through other mental health conditions that they may have presented with, and they spoke to someone and they, for example, we know people with ADHD are much more likely than someone in the general population to have related mental health conditions, whether that's anxiety, depression, OCD, insomnia. So you may present for one of those conditions. And I know that if I've seen someone in practice, maybe years before, I would have just thought, okay, well, my training was, if you've got OCD, we'll treat the OCD. And of course, I'm always alert to whatever else might be going on. Now, and certainly in the last few years, I'd be much more, yes, it's OCD, but what else is going on here? Are you having struggles sleeping? How busy is your mind? So we'll be looking at those signs, a bit like your early first question. That might lead me to think, well, actually, there may be some neurodivergence going on here. And then that might be suggested to them by a practitioner in those conditions. So they're the kind of things, whether someone else has been diagnosed, informed, being aware. A lot of workplaces now, and certainly I work with a lot of people in workplaces where they'll be running training, awareness training. There are neurodiversity groups and support networks, and all of that is getting that sort of word out there and helping people connect and understand and see themselves and some of the manifestations in ways that they just wouldn't have necessarily recognized or thought of as being anything other than just their norm, but maybe masking it and thinking, am I the only one that thinks like this? And it's exhausting.
The comorbidities you mentioned is fascinating.
Yeah.
What first took me to care was over drinking alcohol too much. And I now strongly believe that was me self-medicating my ADHD.
Yeah.
I suppose what other, if left untreated, the traits of undiagnosed ADHD, how can they spiral out of control and manifest negatively in someone's life, perhaps without them even knowing?
Yeah. Well, again, what I would see in practice is there's definitely the self-medicating through drinking, again, that dopamine hit, and also to sort of calm the busy mind, and that peddling and of trying to kind of recover from maybe some really intense hyper-focused work and then letting off steam. The very impulsive behaviors don't help with that. But also what I'll see is anyone kind of, again, getting caught up in maybe any kind of addictive patterns of behavior, whether that's drinking, drug taking, shopping, sex, all sorts of numbing or kind of dopamine type patterns of behavior. A lot of people are very work addicted as well. Wherever you get your kicks and it makes you feel good about yourself can often be one of the more destructive ways that we sort of manage ourselves. And some of those will have benefits, costs as well. And I think as well, some of the sort of coping strategies mean that other areas of our lives can start to really struggle. And that then can give rise to other sort of patterns of behavior. You know, if we're not taking care of our health, our relationships, other areas of our lives, we can really start to struggle with our sort of physical health as well as our mental health. And you know, and a lot of people don't necessarily attribute that to ADHD or how they're managing themselves. But they certainly, when I speak to people as they get that diagnosis or after they've had a diagnosis, take it much more seriously. The elements of neglect that can cause other issues if they're not careful.
We spoke briefly and you mentioned overcompensating a lot and how people with ADHD, if they don't understand their own patterns, can overcompensate their energy levels. Can you give an example of this and how it might be harmful if left untreated?
Well, for me, overcompensation can have various manifestations. And I think that a lot of it will go, again, giving you some examples of stuff that I would typically see in practice. But for me, it comes back to almost when we're younger. So someone with ADHD, typically, no matter how together they may appear, senior, professional, successful, slick, will undoubtedly have struggled in their earlier life to get by, to fit in, to kind of match their potential. They'd have heard messages, and I've not worked with anyone to date that hasn't had an experience around this where there may be that mismatch. If only you tried harder, you've got great potential, but just try harder. You know, you hear lazy, not trying hard enough. You go through this process of being delivered negative labels, maybe well-intentioned ones, maybe ones that to someone neurotypical wouldn't have such a profound effect. But if you're getting them in multiple scenarios and you're being told by people you're too much, not enough, it's really confusing as an identity piece, but you internalize that. How can that not affect your self-esteem, how you feel and know you are perceived in the world? So that comes down to self-worth, self-esteem. So you carry that through life and you feel, again, clients I work with will often talk about how they experience, whether you call it imposter syndrome or not being good enough. So there's always a sense of trying to prove yourself. There's often as well, clients that I will talk to will often reveal that they'll go to great lengths to be beyond criticism, beyond reproach, because they've had enough of that. They're expecting it. It's very painful, but way beyond the point at which it's reasonable, the lengths that they're going to. So that's where it starts to manifest as an adult. I think there's a lot of overcompensating because you're so used to doing it and having to work harder. But I also see, so that's more kind of as a person psychologically, how you feel you need to be in the world, to be accepted, to be loved, to be seen as good enough. The other thing that I will see, and clients will often mention, I was talking to a client just the other day when they were talking about how they'd struggled to get started on a particular project. They hadn't been given a particular time frame, which is really not great for someone with ADHD because you need that clear deadline, what is expected. So she knew that. She knew that was one of her challenges, and she didn't have the deadline on this project. So she'd kind of not prioritized it. And actually, she'd been beating herself up for that, but she hadn't been sitting there twiddling her thumbs. And we spoke about this. And she said, no, I was doing this, and this. I said, so you're doing your job. Anyway, she had been, but she hadn't acknowledged any of that. She then got a note saying, I need this project delivered by tomorrow morning, which for her was great because she got started, but it terrified her because she hadn't started it. And she said, I knew it was about 2 hours of work because she'd already worked out what it would be. Anyway, she ended up spending between 6 and 7 hours on this project. She had already appraised, because I've given her those coping strategies, because with time blindness, you've got to be really careful. You don't double count your time, over or underestimate how long something's going to take. So she's become pretty effective at doing that. She ended up spending nearly more than 3 to 4 times on that project. And when we broke that down, she explained that she felt guilt, shame, a mess, as though she owed it. Now, all of this is happening behind closed doors. The project looks the exact same when she hands it over. That's the mental and emotional gymnastics. That's just one example that she was describing. And not only does that then cause so much distress in that moment, you're not going to do your best piece of work. So that's hence why it takes so long. But that sense that you're not allowed to go to bed, you're not allowed to have your bath or your dinner. These are rules that we make up for ourselves and then somehow live by without being conscious. And then, of course, it has a knock-on effect the next day because you are depleted. Because as we were exploring, she just said I was good for nothing the next day. I had another project to do. So that is how people can overcompensate. Other people may overcompensate socially or at work, where they will people please. And they squander their budget of time and energy in the sort of misguided, sense that they need to go over and above what someone else might do just to be accepted or to be loved or to be good enough. And people get themselves into real binds with it because it's exhausting.
What do you think the other costs are to this not desire, but this tendency to overcompensate?
Well, burnout. So it's not uncommon anyway with someone with ADHD. I mean, anyone can get burnout, but if you're pushing yourself to deliver to this standard that you haven't really verified, and actually in my experience of working with clients, when you actually start really challenging, well, how do you know when good enough is good enough? And of course, they'll keep raising the bar, typically. So burnout. I think as well, what is a feature of that is if you don't know when good enough is good enough, you can be very liberal in how you squander your time and energy. So you're doing the same amount of effort on something that really doesn't deliver any extra benefit. That's exhausting. It's a waste of energy and stops you really excelling and playing to your strengths in the other areas. So that's one of, for me, a huge cost in terms of performance and optimizing. But also what you don't get is this kind of validation that in an ideal world, when you do something and you learn and you develop your skills, your expertise and experience, you start to feel more confident about your ability to do that. That's that feedback loop. And if you can't validate for yourself because you keep raising the bar, you don't kind of reach that point of going, do you know what, I know I'm good enough at this, but this I still need to master, so I'm going to put my energy there. So for me, it kind of dilutes your performance. It definitely can create burnout. I think as well, the other things, like I mentioned, it leads people to neglect other areas that are really important for our longevity and for stamina building. It's that all or nothing mentality. We will not go to the gym. We won't. I spoke to someone the other day, they hadn't cooked themselves a meal for days. They'd eaten, but junk. And some of that's that dopamine and craving, but their thing was, well, I haven't got time. And of course, they're not fueling themselves in a way. We don't think straight. When it can give rise to all sorts of unhealthy, connected dynamics and behaviours in our lives that can leave us really exhausted and burnt out.
You mentioned something there about remembering your achievements. And for me, that's always been an issue. Yeah. I often struggle to remember my achievements. So when I come to do it again, I don't think I can do it. And I suppose that's what we might call imposter syndrome. Yeah. I do a bit of work, I talk on stage, I complete a project, say it goes well, I don't store that sense of achievement in my brain. It might be momentarily, but come a week, a month, it's gone. So do you have any tips, any hacks in sort of lowering the chances of, I suppose we could call it success amnesia, or just helping people to actually remember and celebrate their wins and to cement them in their memory? Yeah.
Well, a lot of the work that I will be doing with my clients when I'm helping them develop strategies, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, but particularly with neurodivergent, there's that propensity for this. It will be acknowledging the wins. I mean, people with ADHD are typically hypercritical because they've internalized that narrative and then run with it and then gone for it and added onto it. So that is constantly at play. One of the features, as we know, of ADHD will be that very busy, impulsive mind, and that impulsivity and hyperactivity, again, it's not often that external behavior. It is quite often in busy, hyperactive mind that is the feature. So it really runs havoc with that critical sort of inner narrative. So a lot of the work that I'll be doing is each day acknowledge what you have done today. And it can seem really sort of a small thing, but we need to learn how to layer on that ability to genuinely balance out how we validate what we're doing. This is not about just becoming a cheerleader to us. So that doesn't really mean much. It's about saying, what have you actually done? Because typically people with that sort of negative filter, ADHD brain will go to, I haven't done this, and I haven't done that, and I haven't done this, completely in the absence of what has been done. So if you start doing that on a day-to-day basis and looking at what you have progressed, it then becomes habit. And that is something you would definitely do after you've done a talk. And what I'd probably say is remind yourself of how it feels before a talk. It will be very familiar. And then you can go, I've been here before. I know this feeling. Why do I know this feeling? Oh, I've done it lots of times. I'd also probably, with things that really can feel quite anxiety-provoking and stressful, because it's almost like a fresh experience and not feeling that we're equipped or skilled to do it, I'd say probably do a journal entry straight after. What did you do? Or as you go, what do you do to prepare? How did you set yourself up for success? What have you learned? Because for me, one of the things psychologically that really helps all of my clients optimize, whether, again, certainly when we're ADHD, it's that learning from the data that we get day in, day out, whether it's that about our energy levels, what conditions do we thrive in? How do we cope? Is it the best coping strategy? Where do we pull on that strength to be able to do that talk? And then documenting it rather than literally forgetting you've done it and feeling that you're going from scratch again. And also not necessarily interpreting some of the genuine anxiety and nerves that go with any kind of performance and interpreting that as because you're not good enough, which is often the interpretation, whereas some other people that I work with who may be more neurotypical, and it's not necessarily as neat as this, because, of course, not all ADHD people will see this and some neurotypical people will still also struggle. But it's that sense of, if I'm feeling this anxious, it must be because I'm not very good at it or I can't do it. And that needs to be challenged as a thought. Why? It's a natural adrenaline rush. What can you do to help yourself feel calm? And again, just reminding yourself that you've done it. It's okay. It's natural to feel nervous. It's not confirmation or evidence that you're not good at it or going to do a good job.
I think it's great because you can actually read that, right?
Yeah.
Before you're about to go on stage or whoever. Yeah. But before you're about to do the thing you think you can't do, you can read the journal entry of the feelings you've had after you actually did it.
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And it becomes what, you internalize and normalize that process. So it becomes familiar, if not necessarily more pleasant. It's like, no, I've got this. It's okay. I know what I'm doing. And a lot of people that I see, and I'll explain to a lot of my clients, a lot of people with ADHD, again, whether diagnosed or not, they'll often be almost kind of working like they're still doing their apprenticeship in terms of the effort and the needing to prove themselves decades sometimes into learning their craft. It's like, you've earned your stripes. Don't worry that someone's going to come along and tell you can't do this. If it is a new job, if it's a new sector, if it's a new thing, absolutely go in humble. We don't know it all. That's a really healthy attitude. But to keep thinking you've got to keep proving yourself to yourself when you've done something multiple times, it can be quite hard to accept that you've mastered a small, but very important part of your craft. It's not being big-headed. It's not a trick. If the evidence is there, collect the evidence as you go, but let that absorb. There's enough other areas of our lives where, you maybe aren't genuinely doing as well as you'd like, and that's fine. But don't, kind of do yourself the disservice of not acknowledging, actually, if you've been doing something for a number of months or years, how realistic is it that you're not probably going to know your stuff? Actually.
You think I should impulsively I'm good at talking on stage, tattooed on my arm.
I think if that is going to be something that anchors you and reminds you, I would definitely consider doing something like that. And you can do a version of tattooing just by, again, reminding yourself and doing the work. A lot of people want a quick fix these days. And I include myself in that. We live in a fast-paced world. But a lot of the psychological hacks and tricks, so now what I've got my diagnosis, I'm still me, there isn't an easy quick fix. It hasn't been hiding from us. We've just got to understand ourselves, understand what strategies have worked for us and in what conditions, and then leverage them.
Do you think the modern way of living, 5 a.m. workouts, all these trendy self-improvement methods are helpful to the ADHD community?
I'm going to give a classic sort of psychologist answer here and go, sometimes yes, sometimes no. I'd say anything that inspires anyone to make a change is going to be something positive. And in my experience, there might be one thing that someone that you respect or like, or, they suggest something and it's at the right time. And psychologically, you're primed, you're ready to hear it. Great. Because if you're exposed and that makes that shift, I think really typically what I see more often in reality is when things are curated and posted as the perfect 5 a.m. start, what I will see behind closed doors is people going, oh my gosh, I did it for 4 days and I failed miserably. And that all or nothing mindset that ADHDers classically can have, pass, fail, success, failure, it can be debilitating to kind of think, oh, there's another thing I failed at.
I can't tell you the amount of gyms I've joined and then had to hand in my notice, cancel the membership, full of shame because I've gone excitedly bought the protein shake, gone for a week, never gone again. I've done that so many times.
That is one of those classic repeat behaviours where it's demoralising after a while, isn't it, Alex? And again, it's that enthusiasm, that impulsivity. That will work. Maybe this time it will be different. That optimistic thinking. And then that bitter reality of thinking, hang on, I didn't think this through with me in mind. And if I hate early morning starts and my natural circadian rhythm is that I'm a night owl, what makes me think I'm all of a sudden going to be the person that consistently, because that's where the success lies in these routines, is if it is maintained habitually, it's that compounding effect. Why would you be this person that gets up all of a sudden at 5 o'clock in a consistent kind of way? It's not realistic. So I would always say to my clients, less is more. Go for small incremental changes, which definitely doesn't give the dopamine hit. It definitely doesn't give that all or nothing, I'm on, it's a new drive. But actually, it does much more for your confidence. It does much more for your self-esteem. And the pressure is off. So if you've got, I don't know, a goal to be fit or particularly around a particular sport or something, start small in a way that you can actually fit in and maintain. And don't expect the bells and whistles.
I call it...
Stick with it.
I call it the ideas shelf. So before I impulsively do any big action now,
Yeah.
whether that's start a business or even the medium things like joining a gym, I
Yeah.
don't act on it. I put it on my ideas shelf. If I'm still sort of looking over my shoulder at the ideas shelf, in a couple of weeks, after I've realised actually, once I'm over this initial excitement, am I going to really enjoy the harder bits? Am I actually going to really enjoy getting up at 5 a.m.? Am I going to really enjoy filling in a tax return after I'm over the initial excitement of buying the domain and doing the branding, which is the fun stuff? And more often than not, it's no. So I don't join the gym. I don't start that business. And that just putting that gap between the
that pause.
impulse. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of that sort of shelf that you put it on. And I think that's one of the kind of key strategies that neurotypical people typically learn younger, and it becomes easier to them because they're not caught up in this kind of torrent of ideas and enthusiasm and energy. And for me, it's like a firework quite often. It's that it goes up and down. So deflating. But again, what I feel is really sad is that, a lot of ADHD is before they get a diagnosis, and even sometimes when they do have the diagnosis, out of habit, it'll be, see, I can't even. And the thing that they're comparing themselves to is maybe someone who is having a lot of help around them. They're naturally a morning person. For them, 5 o'clock, I know I'm a natural morning person. So for me, getting up at 5 o'clock isn't ever an issue. But it's not because I've got this superhuman, you won't see me awake much after 10 o'clock at night. You can't do it both ways. It isn't a badge of honor. You've got to kind of go, who am I? What am I also doing it for? Am I doing it because people are telling me I should? Like, why get up at 5 o'clock if it doesn't make sense to you? Because again, we're not going to do things if it doesn't make sense. And that a lot of the time when I'm with my clients, I'll find that things that they sort of quote unquote failed at are things they didn't really want to do in the first place. They didn't care enough about it to stick with it. But so I'd say, let yourself off the hook. Don't even set it. If it's getting fit and you don't like the gym and your evidence tells you that you've had 17 memberships that you've cancelled, find something else. See what could be interesting to you and have fun. Don't expect it to happen immediately. Take the pressure off yourself.
Absolutely. There's 100% a difference, right, between what excites me in the short term and what I'm intrinsically motivated to do. And I think, like you said, putting that gap between can often isolate the two quite easily.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a correlation between neurodivergence and high-performing and highly successful people?
I think in my world, the clients I'm working with, absolutely. I'm working with senior leaders, CEOs, bright teams, creatives, and finance individuals. And there's always going to be an element, high proportion of neurodivergent people in those worlds, diagnosed or undiagnosed. So I think an answer would be yes. However, as a psychologist, I'm going to say that's a correlation. It's not necessarily the causal factor. So it could be that actually proportionally, we hear the stories of the really successful neurodivergent individuals. And I think as well, the reality is that for every really successful, bright person, I think that people with a neurodivergent are in the right environments and have the ability to play to their strengths and have the routines and structures that help them thrive. Absolutely. There are many more that find themselves in a system where they've just had challenge after challenge. And so I think that with the right conditions and environment, absolutely, that correlation could almost be causation. But I do think it's again, a complex picture really, because I think there are a lot of very talented, bright individuals that have struggled so much and they've just lost their way. They didn't spend enough time in the classroom because they were being sent out. And then you're lost to the system. And then if you haven't been able to channel that, they could, in another world or universe, have been hugely successful. So I think it's there is a correlation, but it's much more complex. And I think that out of the sort of business world, if you like, there's a lot more of a struggle. And we know that people with ADHD or neurodivergent people are not even making it into the workplace statistically. Certainly, I can't remember the statistic, but I think, on the neurodiversity and business statistics that came out for the conference that's on tomorrow, I think it's something that's still only 13 or 16% of autistic people in the workplace, which is woefully low. So of that proportion that are in the workplace, I think they are inevitably going to be the ones that have been successfully managed to work through the sort of mainstream system, make it into a job, but they'll often have struggles navigating that world through masking, etc. So I know it's a kind of, we did answer back to the question, but I don't think it's necessarily simple. I think we hear the stories. I think if people are successful, then
if we were just to focus on the successful ones, and I suppose probably some of the ones you see.
Yeah.
Do you see a correlation between the high performance and an element of the need to be in control and being a bit of a control freak?
Yeah. Well, I would see definitely highly successful people will inevitably be driving their path, their actions very intentionally. That can look and feel and be expressed as controlling, control freakery, if you like. A lot of clients might use that phrase. So yeah, I think there's inevitably a lot of that. I think as well with neurodivergent individuals, you've got people that are very driven. A lot of the time it is, well, I'll just get it done myself. So again, that kind of feeds into it. And then when do you let go? And I think the really successful are people that know how to let go and surround themselves then with the people that will run with the ideas that they might get bored of. And a lot of the people that I've seen that are hugely talented can become like a victim almost of their control because they don't know when to let go. They control or hold on to things that just are not the right things to be holding on to. So what I'm doing when I'm working with clients that are doing that would be like, what is it that's making you hold on to them? And helping them understand. Because a lot of the time it's anxiety. Sometimes it's a habit and it's out of necessity. And of course, if someone ADHD is a night owl and they're working through the night and kind of busy brain, who else are you going to ask during the night to do that? So a lot of it does kind of happen outside of hours. Or maybe because you're the only one with that vision. But then there comes a time where you need to know when to let go.
What if you can't let go? What if you're someone who's so compelled to work, you've got so much insecurity driving you that you don't know how to stop? What about that person?
Well, that's not an unusual one, Alex. And I think that, again, for me, from a psychological perspective, what I'd be working with my client on is really trying to understand. I mean, if it was obvious, they'd be able to work this out themselves. But it's through me kind of excavating by questioning and asking and looking for the gaps, blind spots, conflicting answers. We always can stop. But what is it really at the core that's making you hold on to that? And people come up with the most elaborate, brilliant answers and excuses. But when you start to kind of chip away at it, you kind of go, but is that really where your energy and effort needs? Like, what are the costs to you holding on to that, not letting go? Yes, it won't be done the same way you do. Yes, it won't be done as quickly, perhaps. But if you can find the right people, what would the benefits be of letting go? What would that free you up to do? Sometimes that's an easy one once you can see it like that. Other times it might be confronting that, again, that sense of deep fear of failure. But if I let go of all of that and then I'm not successful, it just proves I'm not good enough. I'm not okay. So we can put in loads of strategies and support and reframing once you understand the psychological sort of barriers or motivators to holding on to things or why we do certain things. And then we hold on to the things, certainly if I'm working with a client, I'd be like, no, that's one thing you do need to hold on to. You are definitely the best person for that job. That is not one to delegate because it's your unique brain, vision, absolutely. So you just kind of make sure that you're curating the right set of responsibilities whilst not just saying, drop it, let go, because that won't work. It's a bit like saying, stick to a routine. If it hasn't worked in the past, just letting go isn't going to work. And actually, in my experience, they're the sort of leaders and managers that can drive their team potty because they go, well, you've delegated and now you're micromanaging me. And it can be really difficult working into someone that's like that because they struggle to trust others. So, of course, people around them will often disappoint because they haven't been trained, given an opportunity to grow, maybe fail, develop the skills. So you'll often find that people like that will not have the right people around them either because they haven't let go. But it takes a leap of faith.
It's so, I relate to it a lot. I think I'm personally driven a lot by insecurity, and I would fear that if I took steps to manage that insecurity, it might dampen and dilute my trajectory.
And I don't think that's an uncommon fear. And I think that it's in practice, you will never dampen. This is what I'll often say to my clients. The fear is, even if I wanted, or you wanted me to change you, that is just not possible. You are you. Your skills, your attributes, your energy is yours. So I'll have clients going, please help me change this. Like, no matter how many years I've been practicing, with all the best will in the world, I can't. We're talking modifications. What's really critical about those modifications is that you start to scrutinize really where you are able to let go without any major detrimental impact, and you actually build capacity in those areas that will actually spur you on. So that for me is that really potent mix, and we can't do it all really well. It will slow us down. It's like almost having kind of like brakes on. Doesn't feel like it. But the trick is working out what bits, asks what responsibilities, and to whom.
Do you think, I relate back to this podcast, and I did this podcast on my own for 6 months, and it got to the point where I could feel it wasn't growing as much as I wanted it to because I was doing it all myself. And it was incredibly scary. Eventually, I now have 4 people helping me on the podcast, and now I would feel so stressed if that wasn't the case, because I would feel that would slow down the growth of the podcast. Do you have any?
So you've done that. That's really,
I mean, it was incredibly difficult to make that decision and to realize that I needed help. Do you have any advice for somebody who might be at that stage where they do need help, but they might have a desperate need to be in control that they're really struggling to delegate?
Well, again, it would be, don't look for the answers in the usual places if you haven't found the answer yet. And I think that typically what would help is really understanding what the fears are, and then again, verifying how likely is it that not getting help or getting help is going to be the problem. And I think you probably, without maybe realizing, or maybe you did it very consciously, Alex, even though it was very difficult, the stress and that you were maybe experiencing doing it on your own, coupled with your desire and knowledge that it could be much bigger and better, was enough to kind of get you out of the comfort zone and take the leap of faith. So it's about getting that critical sort of biting point, if you like, and going, well, if you want something enough and you believe in yourself enough, and what's really interesting with people with ADHD, we can be so impulsive, so like unfiltered and uncensored in so many areas of our lives. And then when it comes to something that you're describing here, the restraint is huge. But because it comes to that very sort of deep psychological fear, anxiety, feeling out of control, and the stress that goes with that, and our reluctance to kind of put ourselves in that situation, that something typically has to be more compelling. And that's why people will kind of make leaps rather than maybe gradual process, because you'll get to that point like you did to go, no, I want that, so I'm going to have to do something differently. So I think that for me is what typically would do it. So I'd say to someone, go and find out what it is exactly you're worried about and where you think you need to exert the influence and control, and what you fear will happen if you let go. You won't change who you are. You will definitely not dilute the power. On the contrary, you're diluting it by having the brakes on, but it doesn't feel like that. I do know that. So working, with a psychologist, that's what I'm doing, is unpacking that with my clients. I'm not suggesting it's easy, and generally you'd need some sort of support with that. And I don't mean therapeutic. Sometimes it could be, but often as a coaching psychologist, I'm certainly not doing it. It's not like the world falls right. It's more like, no, you've got the harness on. Don't worry. You're not going to fall. And if you do, there's only so far you'll drop, because we've thought this through. It's
a bit like the pain of staying the same was greater than the pain of not making a change. And
Absolutely.
that's actually what tipped me over the edge to reach out and ask for help and delegate bits of the podcast that I needed help with.
Yeah.
It was that deep, uncomfortable feeling that was growing.
Yeah.
And the realization that actually this is greater now than it will be if I delegate and deal with that feeling of unease, having to trust someone else.
Yeah. So the lesser, so again, it tipped.
Yes. Yeah. I never thought about it before until just now. It's fascinating.
It's a very big kind of feature. And again, it will show up in different ways. That manifestation of it might look different if someone, is in a team, or if they transition into another role and they get promoted. A lot of the time, I'll be helping them kind of switch and transition to different skills rather than keep doing what they've been doing because it holds them back. And it can feel terrifying.
Why do people with ADHD mask?
I think, in a nutshell, we live in a neurotypical world. So we have had it socialized into us from a very young age. I mean, if you think about the classroom, nursery, preschool, you are, well, not so much nursery, let's think school, you sit in a chair. It's changing now. It's more free learning as you go into to school at sort of 3 and 4, but it's socialized. It's not okay to be wandering around, tapping, stimming, whatever it is that people need to do if you're ADHD to kind of soothe, be impulsive, shout over other people's answering. All of that is socialized out of us for actually, in the main, some very good reasons, because otherwise there might be chaos. But of course, it's the ADHD or neurodivergent individuals, the lesser number statistically, that have to conform as a consequence. Otherwise, you're not conforming and therefore you're not in the classroom or any of the other systems. And it happens at home. I mean, it's quite challenging, having neurodivergent children for most parents, even if they're neurodivergent or neurotypical themselves. It's a challenge. So our systems encourage, enforce masking. And I think as well, a human trait for most of us, certainly when we're younger and then it becomes pretty ingrained, we don't want to be different. Some people do. But again, they're in the minority typically. We want to fit in. We don't want to stand out. So we learn to mask very quickly.
I remember when I was at school, someone said, Alex, you could be one of the cool kids if you weren't so weird. And if I thought, that was probably my earliest memory of someone trying to correct or pointing out that I wasn't quite what they expected me to be. And I think throughout my whole professional life, I've altered who I am and put a load of effort into appearing normal.
Yeah.
Do you think masking can cause burnout?
I don't think it causes it per se, because I think that, the reality is an ADHD brain is worrying pretty much constantly when it's awake in some form or other. That's the kind of burnout, plus all those overcompensatory things. But the added layer on top of all the stimulation and trying to navigate, the responsibilities, the organization, the getting to places on time, the delivering good work, being socially acceptable and a good friend, all of those things. And then masking on top of that is a key contributor. And I don't know how you can separate any of those bits out from each other and what part or to what extent the masking does. It's just kind of so inextricably linked to how we show up on a daily basis and fit in. And of course, there'll be some days where the masking is more than on others or needing to be more. So for example, a lot of the clients I work with, ADHD, they have real challenges sleeping. Some will have, insomnia where they struggle to sleep good 3, 4 every night because of their heads. It's not okay, apparently, socially and professionally, to show up yawning, looking bleary-eyed. So we pile on the coffee, show up, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, do the whatever we need to do to kind of go, hey, everyone, I'm fine. That's masking. That's even harder when you've had no sleep. Masking that you are feeling fine in the face of really negative feedback. Everyone, to some extent, is doing, but that is really hard when you're dying inside because you're crushed. So I think that there are some days that masking is really, going to add much more of a burden than on others. and depending on how your ADHD is. Like I know I speak to a lot of clients where they'll go, I really struggle in team meetings to sit still or for 3 hours, to stay focused. Those days are going to be way harder, require much more masking than days where maybe you are working remotely or in the office and in your own little bubble.
You said some clients come to you with sleep issues and insomnia.
Yeah.
ADHD and sleep. Any tips?
Well, for me, the most important thing I'd say to anyone with ADHD, I say to any of my clients, full stop, but we need to absolutely address all areas, and we need to set ourselves up to thrive and be healthy. And it all starts with sleep. For me, it's about the routine. Because if we're not getting enough sleep, we know from research, we just feel dreadful when we don't sleep very well, firstly. But also, we know from research that our reaction times, our ability to focus, our ability to make decisions, our judgment, everything's compromised. And there are quite significant dips from less than 6 hours to 5 hours that are observable very quickly, but we may not detect it. And there's much more research coming out about the longer term impact of ADHD on dementia and brain functioning and memory. So for me, it's critical that we prioritize sleep. And that doesn't just mean, I will go to bed at a certain time. We have to work out how many hours, what our sleep window is, how long do we need, especially if we've got sleep challenges. We can't just expect an ADHD brain to shut off because it's bedtime. We're not computers. ADHD brains typically will take longer to wind down. And we're often unaware. So again, for me, it's the data. People are often very surprised when I'm working with them that when I get them to start watching how long their wind down takes, it can take hours. So I would say I'm not on gadgets. Typically, definitely an hour at least, often 2 hours before. Like no phones in bedrooms, making sure that if I know I need to be up at whatever time, I've worked back at least 7 hours, but I'm not expecting myself to fall asleep. I'm in bed before that. So that's what I'd be encouraging clients to do. So it's really understanding and educating yourself about the importance of sleep, prioritizing it, being very mindful of caffeine. And that is something I would always really overemphasize when I've got someone with ADHD, because they've got a natural struggle with sleep. So I would say make sure there are definitely no phones, gadgets, anything in bedrooms. And if someone picks up an email just as they're about to go to bed and it starts noodling away at them, that's going to be a real struggle. Someone neurotypical might, I wish I hadn't read that, be able to forget it, park it until tomorrow. Someone with maybe the OCD, picking at it brain, really panicking about it, that will ruin the night's sleep. So there's lots of reasons why we have to be very careful of prioritizing sleep. So I'd say, make sure you get plenty of fresh air, vitamin D, make sure you're eating, really being careful of caffeine, alcohol, all of those things that we know can impair sleep. I would say to anyone with ADHD, be really tuned in. Don't underestimate the management of that in your routine.
No phone before bed is great. And I think also no phone first thing in the morning. And I think there's that analogy of you wouldn't let 100 people into your bedroom first thing in the morning, so why would you let them into your head?
Exactly.
And especially for the ADHD brain, where it can be overstimulated. You're jumping into the world of comparison, overstimulating colours, pictures, sounds before you even got out of bed. Yeah. I'm fascinated to know about the item you've chosen that represents ADHD for you. Yeah. You've chosen a pocket. Can you explain why a pocket?
I think for me, the pocket is represented in many different ways. A pocket is the chaos and stress that can go with ADHD and the losing stuff, where are the keys, where are the paths, and the amount of people I see that have just kind of got their day off on a bad start because everything's gone to pot from the beginning. But everything in a dedicated pocket, it just removes that element of being out of control, stress. I think as well, the other thing that for me the pockets are, it's about being organized in a habitual way and organizing pockets in your email folders, organizing pockets on your phone with all your different apps in different places. For me, it just really, I'm all about designing out anything that causes our brain and our emotional sort of responses to that. Any of that friction, I want to design it out where possible. So the pocket for me is the beautiful item that helps us do that, both on our desktops, our laptops, our phones, our physical self, and at home. I mean, let's not have the conversation about where are my keys every day. Let's just put them in the same place, a pocket or whatever that might be. And the woman's handbag as well. It's another kind of mystery in itself. So putting things in specific places rather than having to deal with that on a regular basis. So that's what it is for me. And it's something I'd encourage my clients to do in a range of different ways. Things in certain folders, whatever it is that helps them stay calm, in control, limiting the chaos and the anxiety ultimately that goes with that chaos.
Right. For me, it's the dog lead, bizarrely.
So dog lead gets lost. You put it in the same place. Yeah. It might not be put it in the dog walking coat pocket or a pocket just as you're in your front door.
Joe, every week I ask my ADHD community for a struggle, an ADHD woe. And it goes into the washing machine of woes. And this week we have... I'm a fairly successful CEO of a startup and we're growing fast, but I suffer burnout often, yet I am admittedly a control freak. How can I get this balance right of delegating so I'm not overloaded?
Obviously not knowing the individual and what the kind of business is and who there is to delegate to, and also the features, I'd say, first of all, really, find out what they consider, what do you consider, if I'm talking to you, the question asker, your real key strengths. What are you doing in this business? Why have you set it up? What are the goals for it? What is the role that only you can play? Then once you've identified that, then work out everything else that you're actually doing on a daily basis that isn't aligned with that. That's a good starting point to think about what should and could potentially be delegated. In terms of the burnout, which the control is feeding and maintaining, I'd also be encouraging them to kind of check their energy levels through the day. How are they using the day to their advantage? Are they doing the stuff that they're really there to do, the unique sort of skill set, in the times when their brain's their most fertile, when they're going to get the best out of themselves? And when are they, what consequences are them, like the control things, having? So where's it kind of, eating up time? What else is it stopping them doing? Because burnout isn't just the long hours. It's the other stuff that we're not doing. The not getting enough wind down time to make sure we've had a good sleep. It's being stuck in a rut of doing and being productive without actually stopping and stepping back and going, is productivity what's required in this situation? Am I doing the right things, stepping back? And we don't make the right decisions when we're feeling burnt out and we're just like kind of doing. So you've got to sort of pause at regular points. Not only will that give you nano breaks, it will help you make better decisions, but actually it probably means you don't speed up and get too adrenalized throughout the day and can make some better decisions. And then wind down easier. And check the narrative. I'm the only one that can do this. It's what I'll hear a lot. It's like, are you really? Or is that just the setup? And what other people do you need around you? Really sort of give yourself that opportunity, even if you can't find them immediately or there's not the budget. Startups eat money, as we know. It's not always possible to get the ideal team. Really think long and hard what you need just now, but what you're going to need in 6 months, a year on from that, fast-paced change. Do yourself the favor of surrounding yourself with the right people so you can build the trust to start letting go. Staying connected with why you're doing it in the first place. Take the brakes off so that discomfort of not doing it starts to bite and become bigger and it gets easier. So look after yourself.
Great. No, it's really, really helpful. I don't think I can add anything to that. You covered a fantastic answer. It's an incredible answer to that one.
That self-awareness is key for everything. Once we know why we're doing something and just being more discerning and catching ourselves doing things, especially those habitual things.
I think also becoming aware of the things that are individualistic to you that might be your early signs of burnout, the things that start to slip.
Very much
often with the really small things. I've said before, it's for me when I remove a USB stick, I always do it properly. I right-click, eject USB stick, the way you're meant to do it. When I start yanking it out of my computer, That for me is a warning sign.
Yeah.
When I miss my dog walk, it's a warning sign. They're the little things that if I ignore them, then I can often, my trajectory, it can be quite catastrophic if I ignore those little things.
And it's so easy to override those ones, isn't it? Again, you've got that self-awareness, Alice, but I'll see that with clients. They'll go, what do you mean early warning signs, or flags, as I would call them? It's so important to be aware, as you say, those unique ones to you. They'll be different. If you've got 10, 15 tabs open, if your bedroom's a mess or things are just, bills are stacking up because you haven't opened any mail, they're all flags to look out for. And
your takeaways
don't
in a row.
ignore them. Yeah.
Bit of a closing tradition, Joe, on the podcast, where I ask, what's the most impulsive thing you've ever done?
I'm going to plead the fifth on this one and not actually answer that specific question, Alex. But I think that probably one thing I've learned is that I know about myself is that I'm very, I have to manage my impulsivity around saying yes to work projects, because it's that fear of, it's the excitement of being asked to do something firstly, and then it's the fear of never kind of getting another opportunity to do something like that. But I realised that actually you can really become a very busy fool and not be a good judge of what you're saying yes to. And actually one of the things that you do learn as you go on through your career and life, be discerning, put boundaries in place, and learn to pause before saying yes. Yes, I will. I'm available. When do you want me? I think it's probably the thing that I've learned and has served me well. Be more discerning before. Say yes with a pause in front of it and say, can I come back to you on that? Like your shelf earlier.
All right, well, I think that's the first time the closing question has turned into such great closing advice. Joe, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I really appreciate you inviting me on.